Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm normally quite mobile when I lecture, but I'll try my best to stay behind the microphone. So the topic of today, this morning, is really about farming with light. I think the first time I coined that phrase in class to my students, I said, no, sir, you got it wrong. We're not farming light, we're farming with plants. And my answer was, you really can't do the one without the other. So the two are really complementary. And the question really is, how is light involved in the growing of crops? And you've seen in the previous speaker, we already spoke about plant reserves that are needed to be formed prior to winter and then used in the next season. I can guarantee you on your daily practices, your cultural practices on the farm, and especially when you're planning new orchards, light will be one of the key considerations when planning and design. And there will be aspects of pruning, maybe even irrigation, row orientation. We'll have the next speaker talking about training systems, etc. These are all considerations that are aimed at creating this optimal light environment for the plants. So the question is, what does the light actually do there? And before we talk about plants, I thought let's rather think of ourselves, because we're much easier to understand in that sense, because we can feel our bodies. And so when you were young growing up, the one thing that you needed to do to be able to grow is to eat. So why do we eat? We get some food. In this case, I prefer the burger than the crickets. So you eat the burger just gets digested and gets broken down into tiny chemical components, and those components can be rejoined and changed. They're almost like building blocks to create new cells, to create new tissues, and that allows you to grow. At the moment, I'm not really growing that way. I'm just growing this way at this point in time. But especially when you're young, without any food input, there's very little growth taking place. Now, in this case, my question was, well, what does a plant do to get food? It can't really pull up its roots and walk down to the local McDonald's and get a burger to get some food. It doesn't have any digestive system. It doesn't have a mouth to eat. So the question is, where does a plant get its building blocks from and the energy that it needs to grow? And that is really what this talk is all about, in terms of where does the light fit into that. And the plant has, I would say to me, almost this amazing process that has evolved, which we refer to as photosynthesis. I'm sure you probably heard this term already. What it really stands for is synthesizing food using light. That is what the term photo stands for. And I thought, rather than explaining the slides straight away, I thought I'll rather demonstrate it, which is sometimes a bit more easy to understand. This is just a light source. In this case, of course, for the plant, it won't be a torch like this. It will be the sun. But what you essentially see shining on my hands is energy, is light energy. The problem is, I can try to grab it. I can't really do anything with this energy. So we as humans don't have the capacity. We don't have the ability to use light energy to create anything. But the plants have evolved a very fantastic mechanism in that they've got these structures that you know as leaves over here. And in those leaves, we have these chemical compounds called plant pigments. And these pigments have the ability to capture this light, this fuzzy energy that we have here that we can't use. The plants have the ability to use. So those pigments that you might have heard the term chlorophyll. So those are the pigments that absorb this light energy. Then what else the plant does, it takes some carbon dioxide from the air and a little bit of water that is absorbed through the roots, and it uses that light energy to combine those carbon dioxide molecules, and then essentially it forms, I don't know if you can all see at the back, but this is a bag of sugar, okay? What the previous speaker also referred to as carbohydrates. And that's really what photosynthesis is all about, is making these carbohydrates. And these carbohydrates are the building blocks of new cells and new tissues. And in our case, of course, because we're horticultural, we're farmers, we're after the crop. That is our desire. So we need new leaves being formed, we need new crop being formed, in this case maybe apples, blueberries. It doesn't really matter what crop we talk about. I very often use apple as an example, but essentially this principle holds true for any type of crop. So by restructuring these carbohydrates, breaking them down, releasing that energy, and using them as building blocks, that is how growth can occur. And this is kind of really what we're after at the end. So you have a chain of events where the light gets captured by the leaf, gets converted into carbohydrates using carbon dioxide and water. This is a carbohydrate. And in the end, we hopefully sit with a nice, fresh product. And that is really, in a very basic snapshot, what photosynthesis is all about. And that is where the light comes in, the light energy. Why is light so important? Because this process, this building of new building blocks, chemical building blocks and energy, would never happen in a million years without the input of light energy. So without light, no photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, no chemical building blocks, no growth, no fruit, no crop. And that's why we said we are actually farming with light, because light is so crucial to give us enough food for our crop. So light determines how much food is produced in the plant, and which can hopefully eventually be used to form fruit. We very often talk about carbohydrates and sugars, but those sugars keep on changing form and shape, and they recombine to form all the compounds that we need. You can just imagine the human body. You've heard about vitamins, you've heard about carbohydrates, proteins, muscle tissue, all of that. So, but your basic building blocks over here are then your sugars, your proteins and fats, and these recombine and allow the growth and development of new cells, which combine together into new tissues and then hopefully form more plant organs. I think this to me is the key of it all. If you forget everything else that I've said, it is really about that the total yield and the yield quality depends on the total amount of, let's call it food, the total amount of building blocks or dry matter that the plant has made, which is in direct correlation to how much it was able to photosynthesize, which is directly linked to how much light it was able to pick up. This is really the link. So what I'm trying to say is that you really can't have more fruit than the total amount of food that the plant was able to make. So there's a limit. If the plant makes 50 units of fruit, it can't produce 300 units of fruit. It doesn't make any sense. So that is where the limit lies and why light is so crucial and vital. So this to me is really the crux of where light plays its role in crop production. But it's not as simple as that, and I'm not going to go into great detail on this one, but the total amount of food, you can imagine there's a lot of processes taking place in the plant. Unfortunately, the plant can't take the total amount of chemicals and food that it makes and push it all into crops. That would be great if we could have all the food taken straight into the apple. But that doesn't work. There are really 3 different processes taking place. So one of them, we need general energy. So some of those carbohydrates that the plant makes are just broken down and used for the release of energy, and the energy just maintains the functioning of the plant for a whole lot of chemical reactions that take place. The other part, of course, is then vegetative growth, which talks to you about your shoot growth, root growth, anything that is basically non-fruit growth. So some of the food is allocated towards that. And then, of course, the remainder, whatever is left behind, can then be used for fruit growth. But all 3 processes, those pathways into which food can be diverted, will add up to the total amount of food that photosynthesis has been able to produce. So looking at the light environment itself, one has to consider it really from a global level and then also at an orchard level. And the global level, it looks something like this, is where we really see where you are in relative on the Earth, in what region are you, because that will directly determine your irradiation, so the amount of light that you have available, the light intensity, and of course it will also determine the length of your seasons. How long is a growing season? So you have a level of light, how fast can photosynthesis go in a sense, but also how long is your summer, for example, how long can photosynthesis take place. So the global level is maybe a factor that comes in before you even decide where you're going to set up your orchard, because there's something that we can't change. That is really something that's fixed. You can't change how much light will shine onto Cape Town, onto your orchard, so that's a given. But the more valuable level for us is, of course, in the orchard level, and that is where you as farmers and producers come in and use your know-how and your cultural techniques to manipulate how much light the tree receives. And in particular, we look at 2 different aspects where we talk about light interception and then light distribution, which is a concept that the previous speakers already touched on. So light interception refers to the total amount of light that the plant actually grabs or catches. And you can see here the light interception is pretty good. You're taking a photo from up into the canopy, and there's a little bit of light coming through. So the more light that comes through and falls onto the orchard floor, I think I've got the next picture like that. So all the light falling through on, this is not an apple orchard, I couldn't find a nice picture of an apple orchard, but all the light that comes through the canopy and actually ends up on the floor is light that has not been intercepted. So it's light that is not engaging in photosynthesis and not really of any benefit to the plant itself. Remember, we're looking at that total food amount that this plant is making to produce a crop at the end. So what we're trying to do is really trying to improve the amount of light interception. How much of the light is caught up by the plant, in this case maybe the apple tree, so it can drive photosynthesis. In this case, you can see the field over here, the roundness, there's very little gaps. The plants are very close together. There's very little light falling onto the orchard floor or to the floor, except the gaps in between here. But if you look at one single production field over here, we see that most of the light seems to be intercepted by the plant. So we're saying that we're pretty close. Probably not, you'll never get to 100%, but we're pretty close to 100% light interception by those plants. If you look at the next picture, this is a picture of a typical orchard. What do you see here? We have the trees over here, and we have these interrows, these alleys, which of course are needed. We need those, so we can't get away from those, and because we need to get through with our spraying carts, etc. But essentially, we find that because of those alley rows, is that our light interception is never close to 100%. And light will obviously end up on the orchard floor, and that's not being used. Also, in terms of the tree canopies, generally a lot of gaps between the trees, rather small trees still, so it will have a very low light interception, and a lot of the light will go straight through and not hit any leaves at all, whereas this is a good example of a very high light interception scenario. And so this is a research that they did in terms of, well, how much light should we actually intercept? And this was done, I think, in the States, if I have it correctly. And they're looking at the total light interception on apple. And it ranges in the x-axis. You can see it's total light interception from 0 right up to 100%. And then they have on the y-axis, on the left-hand side, they plotted the apple yields over here. And what they have looked at is, depending on how much light was intercepted, what was the final apple yield, and plotted those data points. And what is interesting, this line over here shows the beginning up to, until the blue arrow over here, and we find a relatively good linear relationship. So the higher the light interception, the better the yield, or the higher the final yield. And then the pattern starts to change a little bit when we get to interceptions of about 70 to 80%. You can see that the data is much more variable, and that beyond 90% to 100%, there isn't really any data points over there. And they came up with the conclusion that we're looking or trying to achieve a light interception of about between 70, 80% with our trees, because that after that we seem to get more and more erratic results in that. The other one, of course, is the other factor instead of light interception, which is one important factor, but as the previous speaker already mentioned, is that intercepting all the light on the outside of the tree and leaving it very dark on the inside doesn't really help. So you're talking about something that is what we refer to as light distribution. How well does the light travel through the tree? Are all the leaves that are inside the tree exposed? You've probably seen those trees. Let's maybe get to the next slide. You've seen those trees that reminds me of a cypress almost, okay, that has nice green leaves on the outside, and when you look onto the inside of the tree, it's almost dead. That's nuts, okay? And almost dead leaves, or some of the plants actually have the leaves on the outside, and then the shoots on the inside are almost bare. There's no leaves on there, and that has to do with the light distribution very often. So there's no light getting to those leaves, so rather than trying to keep them alive, we rather take them away. Doesn't make any sense. But that is not what we want in an apple tree, for example. We want to ensure good light distribution, that even the inner fruit have enough photosynthesis and light to produce good quality. So you can see over here it's got a very, very low light level on the inside in comparison to that tree over there. So light distribution, why is that so important? Light interception makes sense because it influences the total yield, determines that. Light distribution also influences yield, but has another very important factor, which is your quality effects. So in terms of the yield, the distribution then, of course, affects your flower initiation, the fruit set. Very important, we're going to look at that now, is the pigmentation in terms of the color of the fruit. So it becomes very important, not only for blushed and red apples, but also for green apples. How green are they? Is it a dark green? Is it a very light green? So that's where light distribution is really crucial. Fruit size itself plays a role in terms of distribution, and then the internal quality as well. And I thought the easiest way of showing that it is really so, this is from a research paper by Palmer and Jackson. And this is kind of what they found. So they looked at trees that were exposed to different percentage sunlight. And so I'm just maybe going to have a look at these two columns over here. So we have a tree that is exposed to 100% sunlight, very good distribution, and only 25%. And what do you find if you compare the two? As soon as the sunlight percentage distribution and interception goes down, you really have a significant drop in the number of flowers, flower clusters. The yield goes down considerably. Fruit weight has gone down, percentage of red color has gone down, and also your color intensity. So it highlights quite strongly that really positive and crucial, how crucial light actually is in terms of your production, not only your total amount, but also your quality of your produce. This also just a picture showing a red apple on the outside, inside, very different pigmentation. So that's the inner canopy, didn't get enough light, still very green, hasn't produced much red, with this apple nicely colored. And that is a light effect. So this one didn't get all that much, most likely on the inner canopy. The green apples, like a Granny Smith, for example, you normally find that the inner canopy, where they didn't get that much light, tend to be darker green. And the outer ones, especially if they have too much sunlight, tend to develop this unwanted red blush. And so this is, again, a light effect in terms of pigmentation and a direct effect on quality. Fruit quality in terms of the outside and inner canopy again. So the inside is always that part of the tree that doesn't receive so much sunlight, is where we look at sweetness. The higher the level, the sweeter the fruit. So inside and outside is a lot sweeter, the apples. And that any one of you working on the farm will have noticed that if you pick an inside fruit and you eat that one and the outside fruit, that you have a much sweeter taste there. Sourness tends to be a lot more on the inside in comparison to the outside fruit that gets a lot more sun. And then also a flavor rating that most people seem to rate that much higher, the ones that receive more sunlight. So preference for appearance is a human-based appearance. What do people prefer? And in this case, we can again see that the inside fruit, the people seem to prefer the outside fruit in all cases. And that again is just purely attributed to the light levels that that plant was exposed to. So, of course, we need to kind of think, okay, so what can we do now at this orchard level? Is there something that we can do about the light environment that we're placing our plants in? And if you're starting with a very new orchard, young orchard, I think the key is always to fill that allotted space as fast as possible. You want to intercept as much light as possible, as fast as you can. So the idea is that you plant large and branch nursery trees, don't start off with small trees. A picture I didn't put in because the next speaker will, Dr. Nigel Cook, will present on the training systems, which is also important for total light interception and distribution. So that is crucial in terms of deciding what is the best training system to intercept optimal amount of lights. So you're looking at this 80% level, and then of course you're looking also at your tree training itself. Idea is plant at a high density. Just to give a little bit of an animation, you can see the big gaps, especially when you start off with a young orchard, big gaps over here. This is much higher density planting. So already there's less light falling onto the orchard floor if you compare these two orchards with one another. So you're intercepting more light, which implies more photosynthesis, which implies more total dry mass matter and growth. This would be maybe a year later. Orchard floor pretty much covered, except for the rows, of course, and you still have big, massive gaps if you go the lower density route. and maybe at a much later time would you also fill up the space in those other orchards that are not planted at high density. Just to show you this graph over here we've got number of years on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have the cumulative yield. So they've added each year the kilograms or the tons of apples that was harvested. And so if you just concentrate on the top line and the bottom line over here, you'll see this was planted at 2,460 trees per hectare, so quite a high density, and then a low density, this bottom line, at 1,111 trees per hectare. And you can clearly see that the difference in terms of the total yield, the final cumulative yield at the end after 9 years. So there's quite a significant difference between the two. And that is again a matter of planting at high density, which relates to your light interception, etc. The one thing you can of course control is your tree height, which is quite important. So as a general rule of thumb in South Africa, I think is that the tree height should be between 90% to 100% of the row width. That's how high you have it. So if you say we work on a 100%, and if your row is a 3 meter row, then you would have a tree height of 3 meters. So that is something that you can nicely manipulate and work with to see what works for you. But what it shows quite clear that if you have a small tree and you have your light source, which is your sun, shining onto it, you have a fair amount of light falling onto the orchard floor, which is undesirable. That's not what you want, because it's light not producing anything. If you increase your height of the trees a little bit, you have less. And when you get close to the 90 to 100% tree height of the row width, then what you don't have light falling onto the orchard floor, but you have a little bit of shading at the bottom of the canopy. So you don't also want to exceed. People always said, why don't I grow 6 meter high trees? Never mind the picking and all the other issues that come with it. But why don't I go higher than that? Because you will increase the amount of shading that will take place here. And then you've defeated the purpose again of increasing the height of those trees. So, big thing, don't over prune. Previous speaker spoke about it before. Pruning is important. We want to create that light distribution, a really good light distribution throughout the tree, but we don't want to over prune because we're reducing the leaf area that can actively photosynthesize. So you've got to reach this balance between creating a good light interception and light distribution. And I think that is really where the key sits in terms of managing your light at an orchard level, in conjunction with a chosen trellis system that you've got. Improving light distribution then relates to your pruning strategy. Again, that if it's very dense canopy, you might have to open it up. You really want to have more of what they say, that the canopy itself shouldn't be really much wider than 2 meters. In terms of widths, you want to, and if you're sitting with old trees, with very dense trees, you might need to open them up a little bit to allow that light and improve that light distribution throughout. Of course, this is very often a choice that is made when you're planning your orchards. What plant direction do I choose? The row direction, actually, sorry. So in South Africa, we generally tend to plant north to south direction, and the picture is a little bit misleading, so I'm going to just kind of skip over it. It's from the northern hemisphere and at very high latitude, so this is not ideal for South African submission, so I'm going to just bypass that one. But just to give you an indication, this is one of the studies that was done in terms of the canopy position. So this is the inside of the canopy, so that is very close to the stem over here. That's moving out into the mid position and towards the outside of the apple canopy. And you can see just already in terms of percentage full sun that is reaching the apples. So you can imagine at a light level of 10-15% in terms of what effect it has on your production rate for all those fruit sitting on the inside in terms of quality, etc. So if you're sitting with a very dense canopy, you want to try to open that canopy up so those values over here are a little bit higher in terms of your light distribution that you have. So I think kind of where we're heading is in this tree of the future. We're looking really at a fruit wall that we're looking at. I hope you can all see that quite nicely. It almost appears to be almost like a wall shape, relatively thin trees which improves your light distribution. So it looks like every leaf inside that canopy is actually exposed to very good light levels, can actively engage in photosynthesis. and therefore produce the necessary carbohydrates, which will then obviously hopefully turn into a good crop. Then, of course, you also know, okay, so you do all these things, so you've got to decide, you can't just want to intercept 100% light levels. You have to have this balance. You don't want to go much higher than 80% also, because too much light, depending on your area, can also be quite detrimental to you. So you've got to plan that quite nicely. So too much sunlight, what is a huge problem over there is then, of course, your sunburn issues. And we've seen with Granny Smith, I've seen values up to 30% to 50% fruit losses due to sunburn. So it might be, in terms of Granny Smith, that you need to treat that tree different than a red blush cultivar, for example, in particular cultivars that are prone to sunburn development. So in summary, I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time. 2 minutes? 2 minutes? Okay. 3 minutes, okay, that's perfect. So in terms of summary, we had a look, if you look at this entire talk, is that we looked at total yield and yield quality. Of course, we're not just interested in a total yield, because yield of low quality is really not of any good either. So we want to get a high yield of good quality, which is related directly to the dry matter production. So that is the amount of chemical blocks and energy that is available to grow and to produce food. The total dry matter production, of course, depends on your total photosynthesis that takes place, and the rate of photosynthesis is linked to the amount of light that we've intercepted. So how much of that light energy have we actually grabbed and taken in? And then, of course, that is also determined by the light distribution. What leaves are all active. It doesn't help only the outside leaves are very active and the inside leaves don't photosynthesize sufficiently. And I think in the end, what's left to be said is really that this whole thing, it needs to be a balancing act between light interception, light distribution, that we have and that those together then create this idea of a high yield of good quality. Thank you. And I would like to acknowledge Professor Vian Stein for giving me a lot of the slides as well, kind of to chipper around with. Thanks very much.